Supreme Family Chaos. Beginnings. Creator Eliza Phoenix. Friday had alerted Tony to some suspicious activity down in Greenwich Village, and he had suited up when she had mentioned possible magical anomalies. Tony wasn't a fan of magical anomalies ever since Wanda decided to manipulate his mind, but he had an obligation to check it out. Friday had led him to a townhouse that looked pretty normal, but when he decided to land in front of the door and lift his hand to knock, he suddenly found himself inside. The inside was definitely not what he expected. It looked like a museum, kind of. His curious mind told him to touch everything. Tony managed to refrain, though, because what had come down the stairs to greet him successfully garnered every bit of his attention, namely the most beautiful man he had ever seen, until said man opened his mouth. "Tony Stark, what brings you from your tower?" His voice was music to the engineer's ears. "Don't you think it's a little rude that you know my name and I don't know yours? Didn't your parents teach you common decency?" Tony snarks and smirks when it causes the man's eyebrow to twitch in annoyance. Dr. Stephen Strange, master of the mystic arts and guardian of this sanctum. That's a mouthful. So are you some kind of wizard? Tony fiddles with some kind of pointy artifact until Stephen's cloak lifts itself and smacks the object out of his hand. I'm gonna allow that. Stephen huffs. Why are you here, Stark? Got a little ping on this doesn't belong raider? Came to see what it was, and I find a wizard and his museum. A very hot wizard, but Tony kept that little bit to himself. Sorcerer, Stephen corrects. As you can see, there's nothing for you to stick your nose in. This arrogant fucking asshole, Tony thought. They had barely spoken, and already this man had matched Tony's snark with some of his own, and the engineer loved it. Other people just rolled his eyes, ignored him, or called him an asshole. But Stephen? He was meeting him toe to toe with quips of his own. Tony had left feeling elated after they traded some more half-assed insult and snarky remarks. And he definitely wanted more. Nobody had ever matched his wit like this before. It was refreshing. Stephen was obviously intelligent, and when Tony got home, he did a little bit of poking around in this man's history. Nothing too invasive, just enough to know he had been a neurosurgeon until a car accident had ruined his hands, and in return, his career, before seemingly he disappeared from the face of the earth. He had visited Stephen often after that, usually with constant excuse that he wanted to know who he might be working with if a future enemy called for a magic user. Stephen at first had been snide, but over time just accepted that Tony would only be leaving on his own terms and acted as if the billionaire was not there. They had small conversation, mostly about what happened after the accident, and sometimes Stephen humored him with an answer. Other times, not so much. Then, one day, Tony had visited the sanctum and right off the bat knew something was wrong with the former neurosurgeon. He looked tired. His hands shook violently and he even looked sick. Hey, Doc. Not today, Stark, please. The quiet interruption had Tony approaching the couch and looking at Stephen with concern. You're bleeding, the engineer states when he notices the weeping cut on the younger man's temple, and he goes searching for the first aid kit he had seen Stephen retrieve in the past. When he returned, and tended to the small cut after some argument from Stephen, the sorcerer had given him a confused look. The look only evolved when Tony carefully took one of his trembling hands and gently massaged the pain away. Tony was incredibly gentle about it, and Stephen was too stunned to pull his hand away or even make a sarcastic remark. It was likely because his massage was helping with the pain, and also the fact Tony had a heart. He knew he could be difficult, but he really did care for his friends and the ones he considered family. When he had finished, Tony directed him to the bed, and with the excuse that he couldn't protect the sanctum if he didn't take care of himself. Their unusual relationship evolved from that point on. Tony brought takeouts for them whenever he visited in the evenings, and their snarky conversation lessened. They never went away, of course, but when they did trade quips, it was fun. Talking was enjoyable and comfortable. It got to the point that Tony could ramble about whatever work he did on his suit, and Stephen would doze off against his shoulder. At first, Tony had been offended, but the sorcerer admitted that listening to the engineer talk was soothing. "Like the sound of my voice, Stephanie?" Tony teases. "Shut up, Tony." Then Stephen had laid his head in Tony's lap and fell asleep. It was the first time the engineer had seen him so relaxed. It was also when he discovered that Stephen enjoyed physical affection. Tony had run his fingers through the man's hair, and when he got a content sigh in response, he actually smiled. It became routine after that. Then one day, Stephen had visited the tower. Granted, he had scared the shit out of Tony, who had been engrossed in wielding something together, and the sorcerer only smirked. Tony had been surprised that Stephen came to him this time, but said nothing as they spent the rest of the day binge-watching movies and eating Chinese takeout. That had been the first time they kissed. They had been arguing over something mundane that happened in the movie, and Tony had been distracted by Stephen's mouth, that he had pulled the younger into a kiss before he even realized it. And because it was them, it didn't stay gentle. It very quickly turned into a passionate lip-biting makeout session that left them both breathless in the end. When they finally got around to sex, it was mind-blowing. Tony was pleased to discover that Stephen could be an animal in bed, despite being on the bottom. But he also didn't mind gentle lovemaking when the sorcerer had a long day. Tony took care of them on those days. It was after one of these sessions, curled around the sleeping doctor, that Tony realized how much he cared about Stephen. He would even go far as to say he loved him. So, with the assurance Stephen was asleep, he whispered that love into his ear before falling asleep himself. Completely unaware that Stephen has been astral projecting, he had heard and returned the sentiment with knowledge that even if Tony had been awake, he wouldn't have been able to hear it. Then Stephen met Peter. The kid had been spending time in the lab with Tony, and they were working on upgrades when the sorcerer had portaled into the room. Peter had shouted in surprise, but Tony just grinned and introduced the teen to Stephen. The sorcerer had looked ready to turn around and go back to the sanctum, but then Peter started to gush about Stephen's work as a neurosurgeon, and that was definitely it for him. Tony had said that he mentioned the sorcerer in passing, and Peter must have done his own research because the engineer had never mentioned anything about Stephen's work. Then on the day Stephen visited the tower while Peter was there, he had asked a question that had both Tony and Stephen freezing. Tony and Peter had been working on suits, and Stephen was sitting on the couch nearby reading one of his books when the teen stopped and looked up at Tony. "Mr. Stark?" Tony didn't even look up from the part of the suit he was fiddling with. "What's up, Underoos?" Are you and Doctor Strange dating? That got the billionaire's attention, and he glanced up at Stephen, who was giving him an odd look, before looking at Peter. Why'd you ask, kid? You guys are like the human embodiment of heart eye emojis. The unexpected analogy had Tony laughing for a good 5 minutes, and when he finally settled down and looked back at Stephen, he found the faintest glimmer of hope. So faint one would have to look for it, and if he hadn't gotten to know Stephen, he probably would have missed it. Yeah, kid, I guess we are, Tony finally says, and Peter stares at him. What do you mean, you guess? Never mind that. Peter sniffs and looks back down at his web shooters. Well, I'm glad you're happy, Mr. Stark. You need it. Tony had smiled when he turned back to his own project. Happy? Yeah, definitely. His affection for the sorcerer grew even more when Stephen started giving Peter attention. He made sure the teen was fed. Whenever he was visiting the tower, Tony was kind of bad about making sure Peter was fed, since they both got so engrossed with their project when they were in the lab. Patched them up whenever Peter came directly from patrol, and listened to the teen talk endlessly about anything and everything. Peter was important to Tony, so that fact that he and Stephen got along was a big deal. Then May had passed, and Stephen supported them both through it. Peter for his loss, and Tony through his stress as he went through adopting the teen, so he wouldn't be put into the system. Peter was his kid, and when he came home one day to find his boyfriend and teenage son cuddling on the couch fast asleep, Tony's life had finally felt complete.